there's some things that we need to be absolutely clear about before we start talking about Russia and Ukraine and the new administration in Washington, D.C., and building our movement. Before we do any of that, we have to address some basic things, because I get very annoyed seeing this headline. I just got the latest issue of The Economist. And this headline, "The Imperial Presidency, Project 1897." And I'm shaking my head. I'm absolutely shaking my head, because nobody knows what imperialism is. And if you don't know what imperialism is, you are politically lost. You are absolutely politically lost. So what are they saying with this headline? Well, they're saying that, Donald Trump has talked about expanding the United States to Canada, to Greenland, and to Panama. And they're recalling the Spanish-American War and the U.S. Colonialism and territorial expansion of the 1890s and early 1900s. And they're saying that that's what imperialism is. So Donald Trump must be a big imperialist, right? And he's got his top hat on, and they're saying, oh, Donald Trump is going back to the age of imperialism. Well, this is deeply frustrating to me, right? And this is what they teach in school. I was taught, well, America was one time an imperialist country a long time ago. They said, we took over Cuba, we took over the Philippines, and there was a time in like early 1900 where we did engage in territorial expansion, and that was imperialism. But we stopped doing that, and now the USA is not imperialist, because that's what imperialism is. We're told it's when a country expands its own borders. Well, that's not what imperialism is. That's called colonialism. And that's colonialism. When a country seizes territory and it makes it part of its own country, that's called colonialism. And colonialism started with the Spanish, right? Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue, 1492. And, the Spanish also started going into Africa. And then the British got in on it, and, the French and the Portuguese, and that, yes, the countries of Europe, as they were emerging from feudalism into modern capitalism, they engaged in seizing parts of the world that were, quote, newly discovered because they hadn't seen them, and claiming them for themselves. And that was the age of colonialism. But that is not what imperialism is. Imperialism and colonialism are not synonyms. Imperialism is an economic system. Imperialism is not a policy. It is not something that a country engages in. Imperialism is a system. And if you don't know this, you are politically lost. Imperialism is not annexation. It's not changing or moving a country's borders. It's not mistreating other countries. Imperialism is a system. I cannot say this enough. Imperialism is a system. What is imperialism? Imperialism is an economic system. It is an economic system. How many times? I'm going to say this again, and I'm going to say this again, and I'm going to say this again. Imperialism is an economic system. And I am at the point where I understand what imperialism is in three different ways. There are three different angles through which you can understand what imperialism is. The first one is the angle that predates Lenin, that began around the time of the American Civil War, and even before that. The first kind of glimpse of what imperialism is that I would point to, the first observation of the economic system of imperialism, I would trace back to Henry Charles Carey. Henry Charles Carey was an economist in the United States who was an economic advisor to Abraham Lincoln, and he was very, very opposed to slavery. And he wrote a pamphlet opposing slavery. And the pamphlet was intended to point to the economic roots and foundations of slavery. Why did slavery exist? That's what he was writing about in this pamphlet. Why is it that in America, we're this modern country that fought a revolution against the British, why do we have slavery? And in this pamphlet that Henry Charles Carey wrote, explaining the way the slave economy of the South worked and how that was contrary to the North and everything that he wrote, he ended his pamphlet with this very, very important passage. And this is what Henry Charles Carey wrote. Two systems are before the world. One looks to exporting men to occupy desert tracts, the sovereignty of which is obtained by aid of diplomacy or war. The other to increasing the value of an immense extent of vacant land by importing men by millions for their occupation. One looks to the concentration of wealth and power in a great commercial city, which shall rival the great cities of modern times, which have been and are being supported by aid and contributions which have exhausted every nation subjected to them. The other, to concentration by aid of which a market shall be made upon the land for the products of the land, and the farmer and the planter be enriched. One looks to increasing the necessity for commerce, the other to increasing the power to maintain it. One looks to underworking the Hindu and sinking the rest of the world to his level, the other to raising the standard of man throughout the world to our level. One looks to pauperism, ignorance, depopulation, and barbarism, the other to increasing wealth, comfort, intelligence, combination of action, and civilization. One looks toward universal war, the other toward universal peace. One is the English system. The other, we may be proud to call the American system, for it is the only one ever devised, the tendency of which was that of elevating while equalizing the condition of man throughout the world. And such is the true mission of the United States. Now, that's a heavy passage from Henry Charles Carey. He's saying quite a lot there. But what is he saying? He's saying that England has set up this global empire that is all about concentrating the wealth of the world in a mighty city. It's all about seizing chunks of the world, seizing desert tracts. It's about universal war. It's about underworking the Hindu and sinking the rest of the world down to his level. He's talking about when the British Empire went to India and burned all the textile looms and forced the people of India to import their cloth from Britain. He's talking about depopulation, driving down the population, driving down living standards. And he's saying that in opposition to it, the economic principles of Alexander Hamilton and some of the American revolutionaries, the anti-slavery wing of the American Revolution, was an economy based on economic growth. And like he talks about, one is about increasing the necessity of commerce, of selling and buying, right? That you constantly have to be selling and buying. And the other is about increasing the power to maintain it, meaning increasing technology, increasing the amount of wealth that's being produced so that commerce just kind of naturally goes on because wealth is expanding. So one is about constantly, financializing everything, and the other is about building and developing. And he's describing two very distinct economic modes. And he's talking about how in Britain, the city of London, the London Stock Exchange that dominates the world, that maintains huge fleets and controls the trade routes, that sinks whole nations into poverty while building up just one little city, that drives down living standards, that impoverishes and deindustrializes the country it takes over, right? That is this new system he's describing, the English system. And against it, he contrasts the ideas of Alexander Hamilton and himself, the idea that the state should invest in building infrastructure like lighthouses and roads. There should be a national bank that oversees economic development and is focused on building up physical economy. That there was an economy at that time that was emerging that was about the rule of the world by bankers, not manufacturers, who were essentially making the world poorer and poorer and poorer and centering themselves in their mighty cities as global middlemen. Everyone who has to trade has to go through them, and impoverishing the world. And that was in opposition to the vision of Alexander Hamilton and himself and other figures in the American Revolution of an industrial economy based on actually expanding the wealth and living standards of man. Now, that was the very, very beginning. This was, I believe that pamphlet was published in the 1840s, possibly earlier. Karl Marx read that pamphlet, and he said it was the only economic writing in America of any merit. And he said that Henry Charles Carey was the only economist in America of any worth or merit. And that's the first kind of glimpse of the economic system of imperialism. When Henry Charles Carey writes about the English system, he's writing about an economic system. But ultimately, the understanding of imperialism that proliferated and became the most important was the understanding put forward by Vladimir Lenin at the time of the Russian Revolution. When World War I broke out, Lenin came forward and he said that we're not living under ordinary capitalism. Capitalism has entered a new stage called imperialism. And in our Center for Political Innovation textbook, you can find Lenin's definition of imperialism. Lenin wrote this very important book in 1916 called Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. And in that book, he basically explained why World War I was happening and what the people of the world and what they were up against. This is what Vladimir Lenin wrote, as quoted in our textbook, We Are City Builders. Imperialism is a specific historical stage of capitalism. It is a specific character, threefold. Imperialism is monopoly capitalism, parasitic or decaying capitalism, moribund capitalism. The supplanting of free competition by monopoly is the fundamental economic feature, the quintessence of imperialism. Monopoly manifests itself in 5 forms. 1, cartels, syndicates, and trusts. The concentration of production has reached a degree that gives rise to monopolistic associations of capitalists. 2, the monopolistic position of big banks. 3, 4, or 5 giant banks manipulate the whole economy of America, France, or Germany. 3, the seizure of raw material by trusts and the financial oligarchy. Finance capital is monopoly, industrial capital merged with bank capital. 4, the economic partition of the world by the international cartels have begun. There are already over 100 such cartels which command the entire world market and divide it amicably among themselves until war redivides it. The export of capital, as distinct from the export of commodities under non-monopoly capitalism, is a highly characteristic phenomenon and is closely associated with economic and territorial partition. And 5, the territorial partition of the world into colonies is completed. Now, that's what Lenin was explaining when he described how capitalism was in a completely new stage, and that everything we kind of knew about capitalism was being redefined. Now, what was Lenin describing? Number 1, he's describing the supplanting of free competition. And this is something that that a lot of people that fall into the libertarian mindset and the neoliberal ideology will say, oh, well, the problem isn't capitalism, Caleb. It's that we don't have real capitalism because there's not free competition. The government is heavily involved in maintaining the power of these gigantic corporations. That's called monopoly, right? We don't have free competition. We do have a government that is in bed with the biggest and largest corporations, and that government rigs things in order to secure the power of those corporations. That government sits down and lets those corporations write the laws, and that government actually goes to war around the world to secure the monopoly and the profits of those corporations. And that's not classical free market, and that's not the industrial era of robber barons and steel trust magnates and all of that. This is an era where most corporations are tied in with big banks. Banks sit at the center of a number of different industries, and these trusts, cartels, and syndicates, these huge centers of economic power with a bank in the center of it, a bank that's the lifeblood by supplying the credit, and various manufacturing corporations tied in it. They dominate the world. And what is he writing about? Well, first of all, bankers are in control. It used to be that the people who ran capitalism were factory owners. They made products. Well, now the people who run things in the age of monopoly capitalism are bankers, people who lend money. The financiers who lend money at interest. They don't make products. They make money by having money, right? They give people money and then they pay it back with interest, and that's how they make their money. They're not creating any physical value. They're simply increasing their wealth by having wealth. They pump money into industries. They pump money into various places, and then the money comes back to them. And what is one of the main ways bankers make money? Lending money to the government. Did you know that when you pay your taxes, that money is not actually going to pay for things like schools and hospitals or even the military? No, your money is going to pay back the banks that the government borrowed money from to pay for the schools and hospitals and all of those things. And these banks lend money to the government, and the government pays it back at interest. And that is how these banks make money. And these banks sit at the center of trusts, cartels, and syndicates. And it's monopoly capitalism, where these big monopoly corporations, their monopolistic position is maintained by the government. The government rigs everything to make sure they have what they want. The government lets them write the laws, and the government goes to war around the world and uses its power as a state to maintain their monopoly. And libertarians look at this and they say, well, that's not real capitalism. You are correct. It is not industrial capitalism. It is the natural conclusion of capitalism. It is monopolistic capitalism. It is capitalism in its monopolistic stage, right? One thing that you will learn is, if you study the market, is that capitalism is constantly moving toward monopoly. And in fact, that's why we have antitrust laws. We have all kinds of laws that are written to try and prevent monopoly. The way capitalism naturally develops, some companies go out of business and some companies thrive. And that if the market is just kind of left to its own devices, you get to the point where you have one giant corporation and then the economy comes to a grinding halt. It's called monopolistic stagnation. And so the capitalists themselves have thought of all kinds of mechanisms to keep competition going so that they don't have monopolistic stagnation. For example, here's a great example. Right? A few years ago, the Chinese billionaire who owns AMC movie theaters, he wanted to buy one of the big 7 Hollywood studios. And he went out to buy one of the big 7 Hollywood studios. What happened? And the government stepped in and said, nope, you can't do that. And you would say, why can't he do that, right? He's a capitalist. He's got money. He owns this chain of movie theaters. Why can't he own a Hollywood studio? You know why? There is a law that has been passed that if you own a movie studio, you cannot own a movie theater chain. And if you own a movie theater chain, you cannot own a movie studio. Why? Why do they have that law? Well, think about it. If you were a capitalist and you owned a chain of movie theaters, and you were a capitalist and you then acquired a movie studio, what would you do? You would only show your own movies in the movie theater. Why would you show the competition, right? You want to maintain your monopoly, so you own a chain of theaters and you own a Hollywood studio. It's just basic common sense. You would only show your own movies. And that would lead to monopoly. And they want it to be a competition where the movie theaters are showing movies from various different studios. So there's a special law that has been passed that says if you own a movie theater company, you cannot own a movie studio. And that law wasn't passed by communists. And that law wasn't passed by socialism and the workers' power. It was passed by movie theater owners, and it was passed by movie studio owners because they want to keep the entertainment industry thriving. And if they didn't have this law, there would be monopoly, and that would lead to the entire industry slowing down. There's many examples. I used to work in the insurance industry. I learned that it is absolutely against the rules. If you are an insurance salesman and you are selling insurance to a private company, this is very interesting. I had no idea until I worked in the insurance industry, and this was explained to me. So if you are a licensed insurance salesman and you're selling insurance to bars and restaurants or to private companies, workers' comp insurance, health insurance, whatever, one thing that you cannot do is give a kickback to the person who buys it from you. Why not? Right? I mean, why not? It's your money, right? Well, if you're an insurance salesman, you get paid, you get commission for how much insurance you sell. So it would be just common sense that you would then go to, if you're selling insurance to a bar, you would go to the bar owner and say, hey, if you buy the insurance from me, I get $100 in my commission. I'll give you $50 and you'll buy it from me. So you'll make money. That's illegal, right? That is illegal. Why? Because there wouldn't be free competition then. You're paying someone to buy from you. That is illegal. And there are all kinds of laws like this that have been made to prevent what is the natural working of capitalism, monopoly, right? Setting up a situation where you only have one company. And if you only have one company, there's no competition, and the market comes to a grinding halt. And this is the kind of thing that John Maynard Keynes wrote about. And they used to teach this in economics. They called it market failures, right? That left to its own devices, you get one gigantic corporation that then can do whatever it wants, can charge whatever price it wants, and it's really, really bad for the economy. And so capitalists go out of their way to prevent monopolies. And usually, when it comes to movie theaters, are there 100 different chains of movie theaters? No, there are about 4 or 5. And that's how about every industry is in America. In America, you got the big 3 car companies, you got some foreign car companies. In Hollywood, you have the big 7 studios, and that there's usually a small number, like less than 10, of any of each. So there's competition between 5 or 6 or 3 or 4. We have the big 3 automakers, right? We have the 7 movie. There's a small number of major monopolistic corporations that dominate every field. And the government works overtime to make sure they all don't merge into one, because then our economy would fall apart. And this is what libertarians don't understand. They have said, I have seen libertarians say many times, there would never be any monopolies if it wasn't for the government. No. The corporations themselves have gone out of their way to make antitrust legislation to make sure they don't all merge into one, because they need competition. Do you know how many times that one of the big 3 automakers in America has been going to go out of business, and then the government steps in to bail them out to make sure that there's competition, right? Chrysler has gone under many times. Ford has gone under, and the government steps in and bails them out because it doesn't want there to be one auto company, because that would ruin the car industry in America. So monopolism, the gigantic corporations that are in bed with the government, this is the natural progression of capitalism. Capitalism leads to monopoly. And these trusts, cartels, and syndicates tend to be centered around big banks. And we enter an era where in the past, countries exported products, right? In Britain, they had a lot of coal. So in Britain, you had coal companies, and those coal companies in Britain would mine the coal, and then they would export it, and people would buy coal from Britain. And, in America, we had a lot of oil. So America, we had our oil, and we would, get the oil out of the ground, extract it, and refine it. And then countries around the world would buy our oil. It was the export of commodities. We're selling oil. We're selling coal. We're selling cotton during the slave era, right? The U.S. government, the U.S. corporations, the slave owners exported cotton. That's part of how Britain, got going with its textile industry, as it got cotton from the American South, picked by American slaves. That we used to export products. What changed with the rise of imperialism is that instead of exporting commodities or products, we export the corporations, right? wherever you go in the world, for the most part, except for maybe North Korea, you're going to find McDonald's. McDonald's is a corporation, and it has been exported all over the world. ExxonMobil is a big oil company that does business all over the world. You go to Nigeria, you're going to find oil fields where the oil is being extracted by ExxonMobil, a Wall Street oil company. There, you go to Guyana, and there's going to be oil fields, and there's going to be oil that's being extracted and maintained by British Petroleum. Right? The corporation itself spreads all over the world. Instead of just selling the product, right? We're in America, maybe we have a lot of oil, so we export oil. No, the corporations based in America export themselves all over the world. This is called the export of capital. The corporation itself is the export, not the product it sells. The corporation is spreading itself all over the world, not the commodity. We're not selling commodities, we're exporting corporations. It's the export of capital. And so corporations that are tied in with big banks start going around the world and seizing markets for themselves. They want people to buy products from them. And they want to make sure they have sections of the world that buy products from them. And they don't want people buying products from somebody else. They want people buying products from them. And so sections of the world, they seize territorial partition as their captive market. When the British went to India, they wanted the Indian people to have to buy their textile, their cloth, from Britain. So when they got there, they burned all the looms down. And then the people of India were a captive market. They had to buy from the British corporations. What was Mahatma Gandhi, right? What was his big act of civil disobedience? What was it? Well, he went to the ocean and he got salt water and he boiled it to make his own salt. And he was arrested for doing that. Why? That was illegal under the rules of the British occupation of India. Because in India, you had to buy your salt from a British corporation. The salt of Britain, or the salt of India, was not allowed to be extracted. A private corporation owned the monopoly on salt, and he was arrested for boiling salt water. That's what Gandhi was famous for doing. He would go around the world, and he would go around India, and he would boil salt water and get arrested for it because the British had said, in India, you have to buy your salt from British corporations. It was territorial partition. There's many examples of this. Many examples of this. Imperialism is the export of capital, these gigantic corporations going all over the world and using the world as a captive market. They prevent these countries from developing their own industries, from controlling their own natural resources, and the profits from the markets of these countries go into gigantic, mighty cities like the London Stock Exchange, like Wall Street, New York, like Frankfurt Financial District in Germany, like Paris has got a stock exchange, and that these big monopolistic corporations, they run the government, and the governments use them to seize sections of the world as their captive markets, as their territory. And then the governments go to war to redivide the world. And that's what World War I was. Big sections of Africa were controlled by the French. Big sections of Africa were controlled by the Belgians. Big sections of Africa were controlled by the Germans. Big sections of the Middle East were controlled by the Turks. Big sections of the world were controlled by the British. And so the Austrians and the Germans and the Turks went to war with the British and the Americans and the French, fighting over the colonized world about what sections of the world would be their captive market. This is not colonialism. This is imperialism. This is an economic system. They wanted the profits from the global market to go into their pockets, but there were sections of the world where the profits were going into other people's pockets. So France and Germany and Britain and the United States and Belgium and Turkey, they all went to war with each other over trying to redivide the world of who got to soak in the profits from around the world. And this is very, very important because of the fact that many people, and this is infuriating to me, and I must repeat this over and over and over again, that imperialism is not about development. Imperialism is about holding back development. And that is what people don't understand, right? Have you ever seen the movie Avatar? You ever seen the movie Dances with Wolves? There was an awful movie made during Donald Trump's first term in office called Beatrice at Dinner with Selma Hayek. There is this weird hippie narrative that imperialism is bringing electricity, and it's bringing education, and it's bringing, it's bringing modern technology. And imperialism is bad because these beautiful primitive people, these beautiful, Africans living in tribal conditions and, in the Sahara or whatever, these beautiful indigenous people living in parts of Guatemala that are not electrified. They're living in this beautiful state of nature where the evil white man with his modern electrification and his modern running water and his modern cell phones is like taking them out of their natural beauty. And that's what imperialism is. And that's not what imperialism is. That's some kind of weird hippy dippy fantasy. That has nothing to do with what imperialism is. There are big sections of the world that don't have running water. There are big sections of the world that don't have electricity. There are big sections of the world where they don't have access to modern plumbing and they don't have education. And you know why that is? That's because of imperialism. Imperialism keeps countries in poverty. It doesn't bring development. It holds back development. Okay? That is what you need to understand. Under Gaddafi, Libya became a fully industrialized country. It wasn't until they had an anti-imperialist revolution and an Islamic socialist named Gaddafi took control of Libya and seized control of its oil resources that Libya had a modern electrical system and electrified the entire country. It wasn't until Gaddafi showed up and took control of the oil resources that Libya had a modern educational system, right? Libya had been occupied by the Italians. It had been a colony of Italy, and the people living there had remained poor. And the Italians had been happy to take their oil, but most of the country was fully deindustrialized, and it was living in extreme poverty, malnutrition, etc. And it wasn't until they had an anti-colonial revolution that Libya became fully industrialized. Nigeria is a great example. Nigeria is an African country that is the top exporter of oil on the African continent. There is no country in Africa that sells more oil than Nigeria. And in Nigeria, the life expectancy is quite low, and the rate of literacy is quite low, and the infant mortality rate is very high. And many people living in Nigeria do not have electricity in their homes, do not have running water, and live in very extreme conditions. Many children in Nigeria do not go to school and never learn to read and write. And that's because they're under the domination of BP and Shell and Chevron and ExxonMobil. BP, Shell, and Chevron are not showing up in Nigeria and giving electrification. They're not showing up in Nigeria and building schools to teach people. No. They show up in Nigeria and they extract the oil, and they electrify only to the extent that they need to extract the oil, and they leave the population in utter, complete poverty. There's many examples of this, right? Guatemala has been under the domination of U.S. imperialism for a very long time. And to this day, there are sections of Guatemala where people don't speak Spanish. They speak indigenous languages, where people do not have running water, where people do not have electricity, where people live in very desperate conditions. And the United States has been dominating Guatemala for hundreds of years, but they've never dealt with this issue. Why? Because they're there to hold back development. That's the point, right? That's the point. And they, in 1953, Guatemala elected a guy named Jacobo Arbenz, who was trying to industrialize Guatemala. And the United Fruit Company was worried that they would seize their products. And so the CIA overthrew them, and there were a string of military dictators who were in power, and they kept Guatemala underdeveloped. And there's many examples of this. There's big sections of Colombia where the people live in extreme poverty and are underdeveloped. Why? Because Colombia's government is a puppet of the United States and has kept them in underdevelopment. And there's many examples, right? The century of humiliation that China was subjected to, right? China, it fought 2 opium wars. What were those wars? Well, the British wanted to control China's market. And the emperor of China didn't want them to have control. And one way that the British were able to control China's market was by importing opium, a drug that destroys people, a very addictive drug that destroys people. Well, the emperor saw that the British were bringing in this drug called opium, and Chinese people were getting addicted and destroyed by this drug. So he outlawed the importing of opium. So the British Empire waged an opium war. And what was that opium war? It was to force the Chinese government to lift its ban on importing opium and lift its ban on, and essentially to force China to be under the domination of British corporations and banks. There's one of the biggest banks on Wall Street is called HSBC Bank. What does HSBC stand for? It stands for Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation. So it must be a Chinese bank. Well, if that's what you think, you are wrong. It is not a Chinese bank. It is not a Chinese bank. It is a British bank. And that British bank, Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation, is a bank that was set up to dominate China's economy largely with drugs. And when the British were dominating China's economy from the 1800s all the way up until the Chinese Revolution of 1949, China was deeply, deeply poor. And the only reason China is now the second largest economy in the world is because they broke out of imperialism. Imperialism does not bring development. If there's any lie that I have constantly been told about, and it's everywhere, and it is pervasive and it is wrong, it's this idea that imperialism brings development, and it does not. The Western corporations and monopolies, when they go into a country, they do not bring development. They prevent the country from rising from poverty. They prevent the country from building up its own industries, from electrifying, from industrializing, from wiping out illiteracy, from having modern living conditions. Imperialism does not bring development. The Western corporations and monopolies, their main function is holding back development around the world so that they can maintain their monopoly. They don't want countries in Africa to develop their industry and develop their own cell phone company. They want all the people in that country who want a cell phone to have to buy it from Verizon or buy it from Apple or buy it from an American company. They don't want people in Africa to develop their own steel industry and start making their own steel. Why? They want them to buy their steel from American steel manufacturers and U.S. steel corporations. That's why, right? They don't want, countries in South America to seize control of their own oil resources and start getting rich from selling their own oil. They want countries in South America to have to import their oil from American oil companies, or they want the oil in those countries to be the property de facto of American oil companies. Imperialism is about holding back development. Why? So that a monopoly can be maintained. Imperialism is monopolistic capitalism. It is a stage of capitalism where the wealth has concentrated in the hands of a few major corporations, and those major corporations have centered themselves around big banks, and the government has interwoven itself with those big corporations, and the government and the corporations and the banks are teamed up, and they're trying to seize the whole world for themselves and make the world poorer and poorer and poorer so that all the wealth from around the world ends up in their hands. It is monopolistic capitalism. That is what imperialism is. And this is so important to understand. And there's so few people who get this. Imperialism is not a policy. It is not a policy. It's not invading a country. Countries have been invading each other since the beginning of time, right? That if another country seizes a territory, that's called colonialism or annexation. But imperialism is an economic system. That is what imperialism is. Imperialism is an economic system. And what is the result of this economic system called imperialism? It is holding back development. That is what imperialism is. And this is what the first understanding of it that I would point to would be Henry Charles Carey and his writing about the English system versus the American system. The second and the most widespread is Lenin, because Lenin's understanding of imperialism gave birth to the Russian Revolution. And what did they do right after the Russian Revolution? And after the Russian Revolution, They convened the Congress of the Peoples of the East in Baku. Baku is a city in Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan is, a country that was part of the Russian Empire. It was part of the Soviet Union. After the Russian Revolution, Lenin and the Bolsheviks, they had a conference in Azerbaijan. And at that conference, they announced that they would support anyone who was fighting imperialism. Anybody. If you were fighting imperialism, they would support you. And it was called the Congress of the Peoples of the East in Baku. And they gathered all kinds of people from China, from Africa, from Asia, from all kinds of different places. And they said, are you ready to fight the imperialists? Are you ready to fight imperialism? All right, well, we support you. One of the people that the Bolsheviks supported, and I often reference this because it's very important, was the Emir of Afghanistan. The Emir of Afghanistan was a conservative monarchist. He was definitely not a communist. He believed in an absolute monarchy. He was a very strict religious Muslim, and he believed in an absolute monarchy. But in Afghanistan, the British were the occupier, the colonizer, and the Emir of Afghanistan did not want the British to run Afghanistan. And so he built a very conservative Muslim army, and he fought against the British Empire. And the Bolsheviks supported him. Why? Why did the Bolsheviks support the Emir of Afghanistan? Because he was fighting imperialism. And fighting imperialism is the road to development. Imperialism is holding back development. It is keeping people in poverty. It's keeping people from having electricity. It's keeping people from having access to healthcare. It's keeping people from having a lower infant mortality rate. It's keeping roads from being paved. It's keeping electrification from happening. It's keeping people in poverty. And defeating imperialism is the road to economic development. So the communists of Britain, the communists of the Soviet Union, they said, we will support anybody who is fighting imperialism. And that was very, very important. That was the basis of Leninism. And furthermore, Lenin said, if you support imperialism, you can call yourself a socialist. You can advocate for the rights of workers. You can advocate for guaranteed health care or guaranteed kindergartens for kids. But if you are supporting imperialism, you're not really against capitalism, because capitalism in our modern time is imperialism. And the fight in the world is the fight against imperialism. And what Lenin wrote that was so important was that you couldn't have imperialism. This is a really hard thing for people to understand. This is really, really important. You could not have imperialism without fake socialism. Let me repeat that. You cannot have imperialism without fake socialism. That's something that's very, very hard for people to understand. But in Lenin's great book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, as quoted in We Are City Builders, our textbook, he talks about Cecil Rhodes. Who is Cecil Rhodes? Cecil Rhodes was one of the great colonizers of Africa. He was a British imperialist. And Zimbabwe, before it became independent, was called Rhodesia after Cecil Rhodes. He seized a chunk of Africa and he named it after himself. And he killed millions of African people. The British settlers would go to Africa and just gun down entire villages. And they extracted the rubber from Africa, and they extracted minerals and diamonds from Africa. They got the resources, and British corporations dominated Africa. South Africa, the apartheid state of South Africa, was set up by the British Empire. Rhodesia was set up by the British Empire. Cecil Rhodes, a British imperialist, set up Rhodesia. And I'm going to read to you, this is quoted by Vladimir Lenin in his book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. He quotes Cecil Rhodes, the founder of Rhodesia. These are actual quotes from Cecil Rhodes. Hold on, just got to find what page it's on. Here we go. In 1895, Cecil Rhodes is quoted as saying this: I was in the East End of London yesterday. That's a little more Cockney. I was in the East End of London yesterday, a working class quarter, and I attended a meeting of the unemployed. and I listened to their wild speeches, which were just a cry for bread, bread, bread. And on my way home, I pondered the scene, and I became ever more convinced of the importance of imperialism. My cherished idea is the solution for a social problem. In order to save the 40 million inhabitants of the United Kingdom from bloody civil war, we colonial statesmen must acquire new lands to settle the surplus population, to provide new markets for the goods produced in the factories and the mines. The empire, as I have always said, is a bread and butter question. If you want to avoid a civil war, you must become imperialists. That was Cecil Rhodes, the founder of Rhodesia. And he said that the way to prevent a working class revolution in Britain was to build an empire. And it was very, very blatant that in Britain, the working class people were mad they didn't have jobs, and they were protesting and rioting, and they were setting up labor unions, they were forming socialist groups. And if they didn't become imperialists, there was going to be a civil war. And so what is the purpose of imperialism? What did Cecil Rhodes say the purpose of imperialism was? What was it supposed to do? Let's get to it. Imperialism was supposed to, what did he say? Settle the surplus population, right? Because the factories, they didn't have enough jobs for people in Britain because of technology, because technology was eliminating jobs. And there are all these British people who didn't have a place at the assembly line. So what do? They send them to Africa. They send them to China. They send them to places to be overseers with whips to whip the colonial slaves in the mine, or to, set up farms, or to oversee the role of corporations around the world. And what else? To provide new markets for the goods produced in the factories and the mines. What is that? Well, the British working class didn't have enough money to buy the products. They couldn't buy all the textile that was being produced because they didn't have jobs. They couldn't buy the various products they were creating. And it's the classic problem of capitalism. More goods are created than there are wages paid out to buy them. And so when you have a market that's glutted with products that cannot be sold, when you have a whole bunch of unemployed people that have no place at the assembly line, how do you resolve the crisis? You seize a big chunk of the world and you make it buy your products, and then you take those unemployed people and you send them there to be settlers and colonial overseers. The way to prevent a civil war in Britain, to prevent socialist revolution, was to become an imperialist country. That's what Cecil Rhodes understood. This is from the mouth of an actual British imperialist. And Cecil Rhodes, he was Mr. British Imperialism. You ever heard of the Rhodes Scholar Program that Bill Clinton did, that Rachel Maddow did, that like half of the U.S. Congress did? That's from Rhodesia. That's from Cecil Rhodes. That's from him. It's the Rhodes Scholar Program. And that this was how they prevented a socialist revolution from happening in the West, is they spread their monopolies all over the world, and that gave them enough super profits that they could divide the working class at home. And fake socialists who preached socialism while supporting imperialism were essential to making it happen. And you'll notice that, a lot of people think that the first national healthcare service that was ever created was created in Britain after World War II. And that's not true. The first national healthcare service that was ever created was created before World War I by the German Kaiser. And why? Why did he create it? Well, first of all, there was a big socialist movement in Germany that was going around and saying, healthcare, we should have the right to healthcare. And then the Kaiser realized that if he was going to build an army of people that could conquer big chunks of the world and beat back the British so the Germans could have their own empire, he needed healthy people. And so the socialist movement, instead of fighting for socialism, it was kind of fighting to make German imperialism more efficient. And the result was they created a national healthcare service, and they created free healthcare in Germany. Why is it that before you go to first grade in America, you go to kindergarten? Why is that? This is America, right? In America, we speak English, but, before first grade, you go to kindergarten. Why do you go to kindergarten? Why? Why do you go to kindergarten? Why don't they call it, why don't they call it the grade before first grade? Why do you go to kindergarten? Well, that's because Germany was rising as a country, and there was a great big socialist movement in Germany that was demanding daycare for kids. And the German Kaiser said, you know what? If we have schools, we have public education, all the kids will learn how to march in line, and they'll get political indoctrination and be taught from the time that they're little kids that they need to serve the German fatherland. And so the German socialist movement that was supposed to be fighting against capitalism protested and demanded the creation of public education. And the German Kaiser said, you know what? Works for me. And they created kindergarten. They created kindergarten, public education. And you can read articles in the American newspapers in the lead up to World War I. And those articles, what did they say? They said that we need to set up public education in America because the German Kaiser has public education. And if there's a war, he's going to beat us in the war because his kids are marching in line and they're getting political education and military training, from the time they're kids. And our kids, they don't go to school because we don't provide that service. And that socialism was supposed to be a movement to overthrow capitalism. But it was gradually turning into a movement that was about getting the government involved so that imperialism, that capitalism could function more effectively and move toward the stage of imperialism. And that's what Lenin was understanding. He's saying, look, all these socialist groups, they're supposed to be fighting the capitalists. And actually what they're doing is they're kind of helping the capitalist system tweak itself and adjust itself so it can be a more effective imperialist system. And that all over Europe in the lead up to World War I, there were huge socialist groups. The Social Democratic Party of Germany was the biggest Marxist socialist party in the world. It had millions of people that were in it. The SPD or the SDP of Germany, the Social Democratic Party of Germany, was a huge political organization, right? In Britain, you had the Labour Party. And they're the ruling party of Britain. Keir Starmer, that's his party. You had the French socialist groups, and the socialists were everywhere, and labor unions were being formed, and they were creating public education, and they were creating national health care services, and they were passing 8-hour workday laws. And a lot of these socialist leaders were starting to say things like, well, a revolution isn't really necessary. And that was a very, very common strand of thinking. There was a guy named Edward Bernstein. And Edward Bernstein said that Western capitalism was just naturally turning into socialism. He said, the movement is everything. The goal is nothing. And that socialism is just the sum of reforms. And that gradually, one step at a time, the Western imperialist countries were gradually turning into socialist countries. One step at a time. Socialism was just the sum of reforms. And this was the prevailing view. Now, Karl Kautsky was the main leader of Marxism in Europe, and he disagreed with Edward Bernstein, and he preached a much more revolutionary-sounding message. And before World War I, all the big socialist groups in Europe, they met, they had a convention, and they all pledged they would never support a war. They would never support an imperialist war. And then August of 1914, World War I broke out. And all of them changed their minds. All of them. All the socialist groups, all the major socialist groups of Europe flipped. And they all supported the war. And the Germans, they supported the war. And the French, they supported the war. And the British, they supported the war. And all the big socialists said, whoops, and they changed their minds. And they supported World War I. And at that moment, Lenin said there's something inherently wrong with the standard Marxist theory. These socialist parties are not socialists. They are social imperialists. They may preach socialism. They preach about workers' rights, but they're just doing it as a mechanism for stabilizing capitalism as it moves towards this stage of imperialism, dominating the world markets. Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. And Lenin said, people around the world that are fighting against imperialism, even if they're not socialists or communists, even if they're capitalists, even if they're monarchists and feudalists, they're good because imperialism is the main danger to humanity. And this is a huge breakthrough that Lenin had, this understanding that imperialism is the main danger, and that national liberation, the struggle of nations to fight against imperialism, was a good thing. Before that, Marxists had said, no, workers of the world unite. We don't believe in countries. We don't believe in nations. We just believe in class. But Marx, even in the final years of his life, started to question that. He started supporting the Polish people as they were asserting their national independence. And he also started supporting the Irish national liberation struggle. In fact, Karl Marx's daughter, Jenny Marx, became a big supporter of the Irish national liberation struggle. So much so, Jenny Marx was an atheist, and she was of Jewish descent, right? Karl Marx was of Jewish heritage, and Jenny, his daughter, she was an atheist, like Karl Marx was. But because they lived in Britain, and they saw that the struggle of the Irish people against the domination of British and English corporations, that was an essential thing. So Jenny Marx started wearing a crucifix around her neck, even though she was not a Christian, even though she was definitely not a Catholic Christian. She was an atheist of Jewish heritage, but she wore a crucifix around her neck because the Irish people were being colonized and oppressed because they were Catholic. And so to show support for the Irish Catholics, she wore a crucifix around her neck. And she was heavily involved in protesting on behalf of the Irish people. And so she wore a crucifix. There's even a photograph of Jenny Marx standing next to her dad, Karl Marx, wearing a crucifix around her neck. I'll pull up the picture. I'll pull it up, right? But yeah, this is the picture. This is Jenny Marx, and you will see she was not a Christian. She was an atheist. She was an adherent of her dad's atheistic communist ideas. But she was heavily involved in fighting for the Irish people against the British. And she understood that the main contradiction in Britain at that time was the fight between the Irish nation that was Roman Catholic and the British Empire that was Protestant and was trying to oppress them. So there's Jenny Marx, Karl Marx's daughter, with a crucifix around her neck because she supported the national liberation movement of the Irish people. So even in the final years of Marx's life, when he got to be an old guy, he was starting to get it. But it's Lenin who comes forward, and he says movements of national liberation against imperialism are progressive. And that eventually all these movements of national liberation are going to kind of sort of have to become socialist movements. That's what he says. Basically, if you're fighting the imperialists, the only way you're going to be able to set up an economy the imperialists don't control is you're going to have a planned economy where profits are not in command. And so basically all these people that are fighting against imperialism, they're going to have to eventually set up a socialist society. And furthermore, he says that if you're on the side of the imperialists, like the British Labour Party, like the German Social Democratic Party, like the French socialist groups, if you're on the side of the imperialists and you call yourself a socialist, it doesn't fucking matter. It doesn't matter. You can call yourself whatever you want. If you're on the side of the imperialists, you are defending monopoly capitalism and you are not a socialist. And that Leninism, and this is very important, Marxism-Leninism is not about the workers and the bosses, right? All this worker co-op bullshit. Oh, Marx, all that Marx ever wrote was that there's people who work in the factory and there's people who own the factory, and that's not fair, and the workers should own the factory to get... That's outdated. That's outdated. Lenin said, nope, it's not about workers in the factory versus the guy who owns the factory. That's not what it's about. It's about imperialism, the bankers and the ultra monopolies of the Western countries dominating the entire world, and nations fighting to break free from imperialism. This is Lenin. So basically the same thing that Henry Charles Carey said, the American system versus the English system. Well, that English system came to be the dominant economic form in the world, and Lenin comes along and he says, fighting that system, imperialist, monopolistic capitalism, that is the main focus, and it will be entire nations fighting to break free. But the only way these nations can break free from the domination of Western capitalism and monopolistic imperialism, the only way they can break free from it is by moving toward a planned economy. And that brings me to something that you all should understand, because I have said at this point, I'm not against capitalism as people understand it. I'm against imperialism. Right? If you own your own store, I'm not against that. I'm not against someone owning a restaurant or a bar. I'm not against someone having a new idea in the tech field. I'm not against that. I'm not against any of that. I am against the rule of the world by big banks and corporations that hold back development. And I'm going to show you something. I'm going to show you the flag of China. You should understand this. This is rather important. Let me find an image I can put on the screen at proper size. Hold on. The flag of China. Trying to find a version that I can show and it'll blow up to full size on the screen for me. All right. Hold on. There we go. All right. The flag of China. 1 second. Got to close the other two so I don't accidentally put them on the screen. Okay. All right. Hold on. All right. This is the flag of China. What do those stars on the flag of China stand for? Well, the big star stands for the Chinese Communist Party. But what do the 4 little stars stand for? Well, one of those stars stands for the peasantry, the farmers. They were the majority of China at the time of the revolution. Another one of those stars stands for the factory workers, the wage workers, the proletariat. Another one of those stars stands for the merchants, the small business owners of China. But Caleb, they're capitalists. Are you saying that the Chinese Communist Party supported capitalists? Yes, I am. One of those stars stands for the merchants. And in fact, another one of those stars stands for the national capitalists, the national bourgeoisie. There's one star for the small shopkeepers and merchants, and there's another star for the national bourgeoisie. But Caleb, you must be an idiot. Karl Marx said it was workers versus capitalists. We don't support any capitalists. You must be retarded. You don't know anything about communism. Actually, yes, I do. Yes, I do. Why is it that on the Chinese flag, they have one star for the peasants, one star for the workers, one star for the urban merchants, and one star for the national capitalists? Why would a communist government have a star for capitalists? In fact, 2 stars for capitalists, one for small business owners and merchants, and the other for national capitalists. Why? Why would that be, Caleb? Didn't you listen to Richard Wolff? Don't you know? You must be an idiot. Everybody knows that communism is against capitalists, so no communist government would ever have a capitalist flag. Folks, why is it that on the Chinese flag they have a star for the workers, a star for the peasants, a star for the merchants, and a star for the national capitalists? Why? Because the Chinese Revolution was a revolution against imperialism. And it was a fight of national liberation against the imperialists. The Chinese Communist Party, with its Marxist-Leninist ideology, fought for the national liberation of the Chinese nation against the imperialists. And it was a block of 4 great classes: the workers, the peasants, the small business owners and merchants, and the national capitalists, who were unified by the Chinese Communist Party to defeat the imperialists. The block of 4 great classes under the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. Because Leninism says it's not a fight between the workers and the bosses, it's a fight against the imperialists, and that there are many small business owners who benefit from the fight against the imperialists. There are many peasants who benefit from the fight against the imperialists. There are even many national capitalists, millionaires and billionaires, who benefit from the fight against the imperialists. The fight in our time is the fight against imperialism. And that's what the Chinese flag stands for. And that's what Vladimir Lenin wrote about. And that's why the Cold War happened. And that this is essential. So if you want to understand imperialism, the way New Yorker magazine or The Economist magazine does not understand it, you want to understand what imperialism is, First, look at Henry Charles Carey, the English system versus the American system. Then look at Lenin, Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. And now I will bring you to the third way that you can understand imperialism. And the third way that you can understand imperialism is a new school of thought. It's not new. It's been around for a while, but it's newly popular. In the last 20, 30 years, there's been a rising interest in China and in Russia in what they call geopolitics. What is geopolitics? Geopolitics is the understanding that politics, systems of government, can be influenced by land, right? Geo means land. Politics means system of government. And geopolitics is how geography or the land affects politics. During the Cold War, you had Marxism-Leninism, the Soviet Union, China, North Korea, Cuba, the Eastern Bloc, various governments that were anti-imperialist. And they believed in communism. And you had the United States and its allies, and they believed in capitalism. And that was the Cold War. But geopolitics says it's actually a lot deeper than that. Geopolitics says that if you look at the history of civilization for thousands of years, there are two different types of civilizations. There are thalassocracies, which are empires of the sea, and there are telerocracies, empires of the land. And this is where it's very, very important, because I told you people don't understand imperialism. A lot of people say to me, well, Caleb, don't you know there's a lot of Russian thinkers like your buddy Alexander Dugin? I mean, I met him one time, but, you know, who they believe in creating a Russian empire. So if you support Russia, you're not anti-imperialist. No, they are talking about something different. You go back thousands of years, there are two different types of civilizations. You look at the Roman Empire. Where was the Roman Empire based? The Roman Empire was based on the Italian peninsula. And the Roman Empire, at least at the beginning, did not have an emperor. It had an elected national assembly and a hereditary senate. And why did the Roman Empire not have an emperor at the beginning? Why did it have a republic at the beginning? Because all the landowners of the city of Rome wanted to have a share in the empire. And if they just had one king, then people wouldn't fight as hard. But Rome, with its mighty army and its mighty navy that was seizing control of the modern world, Rome needed all the landowning families to feel like they had a seat at the table, like they had a say in how the empire was run. And so all the wealthy families of Rome, they were part of the hereditary senate, and they got one vote. And then they had a national assembly, and all the landowners, who maybe some of them weren't in the Senate, they got to vote and elect leaders. And that in order to make all of the wealthy people in Rome, all the landowners in Rome, feel like they got a say in how the loot was divided up, they had a republic, an elected government, because it was an empire that was all about building up a mighty army and controlling the trade routes. It was a sea-based empire. In Rome, they had a mighty navy that prayed to the god Neptune, the god of the ocean. They had huge warships, and those warships controlled the trade routes. There was an expression, all roads lead to Rome. What did that mean? It meant that you were not allowed to build a road. If you were in Persia and you built a road into Palestine, they would come and kill you, because the only people that were allowed to build roads were the Romans, and the only people that were allowed to sail ships were the Romans. And if you didn't have permission from the Romans to sail a ship, they, with their mighty navy, they would, light your ship on fire and burn it down. They controlled the trade routes so that all of the wealth of the modern world flowed into one mighty city. Is this sounding familiar? One mighty city wasn't the Italian Empire, it was the Roman Empire. There was one city that all the wealth of the modern world was concentrated in. And in those cities, there were many different wealthy families, and they all voted in their Senate and their National Assembly about how the loot got divided. And they built up this mighty military that went all over North Africa and all over France and Germany and even up into Britain and into the Middle East. And they controlled the whole modern world, and they extracted wealth, and it all went into one mighty city. This is thalassocracy. This is a sea-based empire. This is the English system. This is imperialism. This is a very early, primitive form of the economic system we have today, where one mighty empire, one mighty city controls the trade routes, coins money. That was another thing the Romans did, is they had currency. They stamped the face of the emperor on coins. They coined their own currency. They had bankers, and they dominated the world. And why did Rome eventually fall? Because they stopped being loyal to each other. There was no unifying principle. They became more and more individualistic, and gradually the Roman Empire got to the point they couldn't even build their own army. They had to hire other people. When they were fighting the Germans, the Germanic tribes, the barbarians they called them, they couldn't even get together their own Roman army to go fight them. So they had to go up to Germany and find other Germans and pay them to fight the barbarians who were fighting them, right? And at the end, Rome was so individualistic and so divided. There was no central belief, no central principle and beliefs, that Rome fell apart. And Christianization, the Christianization of Rome, was an attempt to hold Rome together in the final stages of the empire, right? As Rome was falling, they adopted Christianity as their state religion to hold it together. Why? Because all the different Romans were praying to all their own gods. There was a god of the army, Mars. There was god of the navy, Neptune. There were people who worshipped Julius Caesar, who had died, and they believed he became a god. There were people who worshipped Osiris, the god from Egypt. There were people who worshipped Mithra, the god from Iran. All the Romans were praying to different gods. They were all selfish and individualistic. They had no central vision or anything. And so as they were panicking, the Roman government said, all right, we're Christians now, and there's only one God. There's only one God. And that was an attempt to save their empire, to hold everyone together. And they said, we're Christians, and we're going to spread the message of Jesus Christ to every place that we're colonizing. We have one religion, but it didn't work. Rome came apart, right? Rome became more and more individualistic, less and less collectivist in its mindset, and their ability to raise a gigantic army completely deteriorated, and slavery becomes more and more inefficient the more slaves you get, right? And that's a whole nother thing, right? And so gradually, as Rome became more and more individualistic and more not collective and more divided, and the rich became more and more decadent, and there were more and more visions, and it got to the point the Roman Empire just fell apart. And first it divided in half. You had the Byzantine, the Eastern Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire, and then eventually you had the empire in like modern France, and it just deteriorated, right? And the fall of the Roman Empire was the natural trajectory of this mode, this economic system. This is called thalassocracy, the sea-based empire. And in fact, Rosa Luxemburg, the great German socialist who opposed World War I, who was thrown in prison for opposing World War I, this is what she wrote at the time of World War I broke out. She wrote, "This world war is a regression into barbarism. The triumph of imperialism leads to the annihilation of civilization. At first, this happens sporadically for the duration of a modern war, but then, when the period of unlimited wars begins," do you hear this? The period of unlimited wars begins, it progresses toward its inevitable consequences. The triumph of imperialism and the collapse of all civilization, as in ancient Rome, depopulation, desolation, degeneration, a great cemetery. As Rosa Luxemburg is saying, basically Europe as it adopts thalassocracy, the Roman economic system, the empire of the sea, it's going to become more and more individualistic, and it's going to rip apart, and it's eventually going to lead to barbarism, the fall of the Roman Empire, depopulation, desolation, a great cemetery. That's what Rosa Luxemburg was writing. However, if you look at the Russian Empire, you look at the Chinese Empire, you look at the Persian empires that existed, these are empires that are not based on the ocean. They're based on the land. And as a result of being based on the land, they have a very different relationship with the countries that they're absorbing into their empire. There's a movie you should all go watch. Came out during World War II. It's called Ivan the Terrible. Go and watch Ivan the Terrible, directed by Sergei Eisenstein. This film, Ivan the Terrible, is about one of the great czars of Russia. And you'd think, why is Stalin, during World War II, Stalin's a communist? Why is he making a movie about a great czar? Well, you watch this movie, Ivan the Terrible, and you'll understand. This movie, Ivan the Terrible, is about a great czar who united all the people of the Russian Empire. He got the Muslims, he got the Georgians, he got the Caucasians, he got all the Tatars, he got all these different people into one empire. And that's why he's viewed as great, because all the people, when they were united into one empire, roads were built, schools were created, education was created. I mean, it resulted in modernization. And if you watch the movie, Ivan the Terrible, it's a very Christian movie. And it was a really big deal when that movie came out during World War II because the church had been illegal in the Soviet Union. They'd been suppressing Christianity. But at the time they were being invaded by the Nazis, Stalin allowed for this very, very Christian movie with endless scenes of priests and prayers and big church windows and all kinds of Christian stuff in it. And it's about Ivan the Terrible, this czar who brought all of the peoples of the Russian Empire into one country and suffered and worked really, really hard. And what was the message of the film? We've got to stay together to defeat the invaders. We're better together than we are divided, because if we're together, our living standard can go up. We can increase, we can become a strong civilization if we're together. That was the message of the film. And during World War II, what were the Nazis doing? Well, the Nazis went to Ukraine and they said to Ukrainians, you know, you're Ukrainian, you're not Russian. Here, we'll help you defeat those Russians that are oppressing you. And they gave them guns. And they went to the Chechens. They said to the Chechens, you know, you are Muslims. Those Russians are historically Christian, and you're deeply religious Muslims, and they're communist atheists. So here's some guns. Go fight the Russians. And the Nazis were trying to divide the peoples of the Russian Empire. And so Stalin made this movie about the Russian Empire, saying we're stronger when we're together. And if we can be strong enough, we can come together. And if we come together, we can lift ourselves up economically. It's a very powerful film, but it's not about communism. It's about Eurasianism. It's a Eurasianist movie. He's saying that we have a different type of civilization here. This isn't the British Empire. This isn't the Roman Empire. This is a different type of civilization. And that when we are together, all the different nationalities, we can develop and pull ourselves up, and we're stronger together. It's a different type of empire. And why is it that in China, the Qing dynasty, this brutal authoritarian dynasty, is remembered? Why are they remembered and honored? Because they created one China. They brought together all of China. Why is it that people in China get really fired up about Taiwan? It's because the Chinese Communist Party says we brought all of China together. Because the way that China was kept poor during that century of humiliation, when the British beat down China with 2 opium wars, is they broke away Taiwan, they broke away Hong Kong, they broke away Tibet, and they separated China. And the Chinese Communist Party says if you look back for 5,000 years of civilization in China, it's when we're together that we start developing. When we're together, we have things like the first civil service exam that was ever invented. The first civil service examination ever created was in China. The first paper money ever created, paper currency, was in China. When they're together, they're growing. That's not the same as thalassocracy. That's not the same as the Roman Empire. It's an empire based on the land that is focused on development and unifying different nationalities on a great land mass. And you can say the same thing about the Persians, right? And King Cyrus and the Persians. And you can say that there are two types of civilization. There are two types of empires that exist. And modern imperialism, what Henry Charles Carey called Atlanticism, what Lenin called imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, moribund, decadent, monopolistic capitalism. And now what Alexander Dugin and a lot of different thinkers in Russia and in China and in Iran and other places are calling Atlanticism. That is one economic system. And that is what we were up against. Atlanticism. And if you look at the Roman Empire, how did it end up? What is the natural progression? Is that the Atlanticist system leads to more and more individualism, more and more selfishness. All the wealthy people are going in all different directions, chasing after their own wealth, and the society gradually deteriorates from within. Instead of being a society based on the land, where they're thinking what's in the interest of our nation, they become a society that's committed to maintaining a global military to extract profits from all over the globe, to pile the wealth into one mighty city, where a group of rich people fight with each other over who gets the spoils. And from the interior of the empire, the whole thing pulls apart. That is the natural progression of thalassocracy, empire of the sea. However, I would maintain that America has always been caught up in a spiritual battle. I read to you what Henry Charles Carey said about the American system versus the English system. And if you look at our Civil War, it was very much an uprising against the slave system, which was the stronghold of the British Empire and their source of cheap cotton in the U.S. South. And if you look at Roosevelt and how he built infrastructure all across the United States, and how he said to Winston Churchill, we will never again go to war to defend the British Empire, and how Roosevelt loved Stalin and hated Winston Churchill. He thought Winston Churchill was a lying scumbag, but he said, that's Stalin, I like that guy. There is a deep spiritual battle in America. Are we a people of the land or a people of the sea? What are we? Are we people of the land or people of the sea? That is the question. Are we an imperialist country or are we a land-based civilization state? Russia and China are civilization states. They're not nation states. There's many different nationalities in Russia, many different nationalities in China. But they are a civilization state on the land, focused on development, eradicating poverty, lifting people up, modernizing, connecting people with trade, elevating while equalizing the people of the world. That is what they're about. It sounds a lot like what Henry Charles Carey wrote about the American system. It also sounds a lot like what Lenin and Stalin said about communism, right? That we're going to centrally plan the means of production, and we're going to go build gigantic projects, 5-year economic plans, build giant power plants, and we're going to build up and electrify. It sounds like what Henry Charles Carey said about the American system, building the lighthouses, creating a national bank, building up and causing the population to expand and growing the population on the land. Sounds like Henry Charles Carey, but it also sounds like Stalin. And it also sounds like Putin. And it also sounds like Xi Jinping, the Chinese Communist Party, lifting 800 million people out of poverty. Atlanticism, imperialism, the English system is on one side. The American system and the ideals of the American Revolution, and socialism and communism as Stalin and Mao and Deng Xiaoping understood it, and Eurasianism or continentalism are on the other side. This is a deep spiritual battle that is waging. And it is way, way, way deeper. So much deeper than capitalism versus communism. Capitalism versus communism is like one episode in the war. It's like one episode in a Netflix miniseries that is 50 episodes long. And capitalism versus communism in the Cold War was one episode in the fight. And even communism had to change, right? Marx's communism set up social democracy, which became a vehicle for creating imperialism. Trotskyism, permanent revolution, that was also a Western thing. And Trotskyite groups worked with the CIA at this point to fight against communist governments. And Stalin, when he adopted his form of communism, he adopted a bunch of Eurasianist principles, right? If you look at Lenin, the pictures of Lenin they had all over the Soviet Union, he's got a halo around his head. Why is that? That was an Orthodox tradition, the tradition of Orthodox icons. Why is it communist governments are always marching around with big pictures of Stalin's head, big pictures of Mao's head, big pictures of Kim Il-sung's head? That comes from the Orthodox tradition of icons. That comes from the Eastern tradition of ancestor worship. Praying to your ancestors, praying to the spirit of a dead person, drawing strength from an icon that you admire. This is an Eastern tradition. This is a Eurasianist tradition. Whereas individualism and acquiring a huge amount of wealth and saying you have no country, you have no nation, I'm telling you, this is all very, very deep. There is a deep spiritual battle that is going on. But in my view, at this point, you can, like I said, you can call yourself anything you want. You can call yourself a Christian and support imperialism. You can call yourself a Christian and be against it. You can call yourself a Muslim and support imperialism. You can call yourself a Muslim and be against it. You can call yourself a communist and support imperialism. In fact, the overwhelming majority of American communists do. Or you can call yourself a communist and oppose imperialism, like the great Harpal Brar, who just passed, did. Right? It's you can wear whatever clothes and whatever ideology you want. But there's a fundamental divide in the world right now. And we in America are caught in the middle of it. Because we as a nation have always had a side of us that is people of the land. And we've always had a side of us that is people of the sea and imperialist. And we are caught up in a spiritual battle. And if you look at the greatest moments in American history, that's when we become people of the land. John Brown, building that movement to oppose slavery. Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Horace Greeley, go west, young man, and grow up with the country. Westward leading, still proceeding, guide us to the perfect light. If you look at the Second World War and the Flint sit-down strike in Michigan and the Teamsters strike in Minneapolis and the Farmer Labor Party of Minnesota and the Southern Sharecroppers strikes and the IWW and the Wobblies, if you look at American history, all the good parts of American history, the abolitionists, the free soilers, the Black Liberation Movement, the labor unionists, those are people of the land. And if you look at all the evil things in American history, slavery, British Empire, that's what slavery was. Genocide of Native Americans, British Empire, that's what that was. Malthusianism, eugenics, breeding people like people, that's British Empire, that's what that is. Free markets. Screw you, you're on your own. I don't care about you. Poor people can just rot. That's British Empire. Social Darwinism, survival of the fittest. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. British Empire. All the evil things in American history flow from the English system, imperialism, Atlanticism, civilization of the sea. All the good things in American history flow from civilization of the land, people of the land, continentalism, collectivism, socialism, Christianity. There is a deep divide deep within our bones. What kind of people are we going to be? Are we going to be people of the land or people of the sea? Are we going to be an Atlanticist society or a continental society? Are we going to be an imperialist country? Or are we going to be a country with a government of action that fights for working families? This is a deeply spiritual question. And my beginning of it was understanding it in terms of capitalism versus communism. But I think you can ask the question, optimism or pessimism. The British Empire says there's too many people in the world. The imperialists at the World Economic Forum, they say there's too many people in the world. They say we need to reduce the population. There's too many people in the world. There's limited resources. The world needs to stay poor. We need to stop development. And in China, they say, nope, we're building, we're constructing. In Russia, they say we're building, we're constructing. In Africa, the countries that have broken free in West Africa, Mali, Niger, they say we're constructing, we're building. Nicaragua, they say we're constructing, we're building. Christianity, socialism, and solidarity. Grow where you are planted. Start your own business, micro-entrepreneurship. There is a growth-oriented economy, and there is a monopolistic-oriented economy that is trying to stop growth. I'm telling you, there's a deep spiritual battle in the world, and America is ground zero. There's a coming war in America. There's a coming fight in America. There's a deep battle within the American spirit. What type of people are we going to be? It's the Civil War all over again. It's Roosevelt versus the business plot all over again. It's a spiritual battle. What kind of civilization are we going to be? And it's not about Donald Trump. And it's not about Kamala Harris. And it's not about individuals and personalities. It's about deep sentiments within our souls. It's about ideas. It's about spiritual concepts. It's about our relationship with our community, our relationship with each other, our relationship with nature, our relationship with the world. And Donald Trump has said a lot of things I don't agree with. There was one moment, and I'm just going to show you this. The fact that Donald Trump said all that he said in this video. This is a very short speech that Donald Trump gave after he left office. You watch this speech, listen to everything he says in this speech. It's not that Donald Trump is a good guy because he said this. It's because the people rallying behind Donald Trump want to hear this. That Donald Trump is tapping into a part of the American spirit that wants this.
Past generations of Americans pursued big dreams and daring projects that once seemed absolutely impossible. They pushed across an unsettled continent and built new cities in the wild frontier. They transformed American life with the interstate highway system. Magnificent it was. And they launched a vast network of satellites into orbit all around the earth. But today, our country has lost its boldness. Under my leadership, we will get it back in a very big way. If you look at just 3 years ago, what we were doing was unthinkable. How good it was, how great it was for our country. Our objective will be a quantum leap in the American standard of living. That's what will happen. Here are just a few of the ways we can do it. Almost 1/3 of the landmass of the United States is owned by the federal government, with just a very, very small portion of that land, just a fraction, 1/2 of 1%. Would you believe that? We should hold a contest to charter up to 10 new cities and award them to the best proposals for development. In other words, we'll actually build new cities in our country again. These freedom cities will reopen the frontier, reignite American imagination, and give hundreds of thousands of young people and other people, all hardworking families, a new shot at home ownership and, in fact, the American dream. Another big opportunity is in transportation. Dozens of major companies in the United States and China are racing to develop vertical takeoff and landing vehicles for families and individuals. Just as the United States led the automotive revolution in the last century, I want to ensure that America, not China, leads this revolution in air mobility. These breakthroughs can transform commerce, bring a giant infusion of wealth into rural America, and connect families and our country in new ways. Likewise, through our Strategic National Manufacturing Initiative, which is going to be very big and very, very successful, we will turn forgotten communities into hives of industry, producing the goods we will no longer import from China. We will also have a major initiative on lowering the cost of living with a special focus on lowering the cost of a new car and lowering the cost to build a single-family home. And they will be beautiful homes. And I will ask Congress to support baby bonuses for young parents to help launch a new baby boom. Finally, I'll challenge the governors of all 50 states to join me in a great modernization and beautification campaign, getting rid of ugly buildings, refurbishing our parks and our public spaces, making cities and towns more livable, ensuring a pristine environment, and building towering monuments to our true American heroes. Very importantly, I will also make sure all of these new places are safe. We love and cherish our police. They will do the job the way they have to. It is time to start talking about greatness for our country again. I will dramatically increase living standards and build a future that brings our country together through excitement, opportunity, and success. Thank you very much.
That was the best speech Donald Trump ever gave, in my view. And that's not representative of everything Trump stands for. That speech, he said many things that are contradictory to that. But whoever wrote that speech understands that that is something deep within the American soul. We want growth. We want development. We want to see the population increase. We want to, have new cities rise up across the vast territory of the country. That's what we want. So that's what I want to talk to you all about tonight. Ukraine aid is frozen. And I'm very excited about that. And I hope that means that the new administration can negotiate with Russia and that we can end this war in Ukraine once and for all. And I hope that it means that things can start to change. I'm very optimistic. I struggle to be optimistic because I believe it is my duty to my friends, to my family, to my comrades in the organization, and to the world and to the country. It is our duty to be optimistic. We must expect the best. We must expect the best from the world. We must be optimistic at all times. We must be doing our best to struggle and sacrifice to make the world a better place, to have a positive view of fellow human beings, expect the best from them, and demand the best from ourselves.